Hello, I'm Richard Brinson. I'm a director here at FSP and host of today's podcast. Today we're going to be looking at cybersecurity in the retail industry, and in particular the topic of identity and access management, because there's some fairly unique challenges in the industry which we'll get into. But first, let me introduce my guests.
Hello, my name's Tim Hazell. I'm an identity architect at FSP. I've been working in retail and IT for over 20 years.
Hello, my name is Isabel De Sa. I'm the change team lead in FSP, and we support our clients to adopt new processes, new technology, new IT. And our focus is always, how do we help the people through the change?
Hi, I'm Tom Hebbron, partner at FSP. I look after our identity practice. My team and I have been working with, I think, all the major UK supermarkets over the last few years and some luxury brands worldwide as well. So retail's definitely in our blood. Lots of interesting challenges with identity and access management, both in the workforce and, of course, all the data analytics that the supermarkets are so good at doing with their customers.
Okay, so to kick us off, Tim, I'm going to start with you just to help us set the scene. Why is identity and access management a particular challenge in the retail industry?
I think to start, let's say that identity and access management's a challenge across all industry sectors. I think there are a number of things that make it more interesting in the retail sector. Basically the scale and depth and breadth of the services that a supermarket provide. If you were to look at a typical supermarket in the UK and ask what is a supermarket, it's a store with huge stores, with smaller stores. It's a petrol station. It's an online retail operation. It's petrol stations, it's a bank, it'll sell you insurance. The range of different goods and services that you can get from the retail sector are incredible. That involves a huge number of people in delivering those services, and each of those people, whether it be millions of customers or tens of thousands of individuals that work for a retail outlet, it's all about identity and making sure that customer data, sensitive card payment data is kept safe and safeguarded. And I think, again, in the retail sector, what's really interesting is the sort of big bang of innovation that sector's gone through over the last 10 years to make sure that they can reach their customers and they can drive brand loyalty, because that's what's really important. That's what makes them a success, attracting customers and keeping them.
Okay, yeah, great. Tom, just come to you. We know that supermarkets are really, really good at understanding customer data, and as part of that, they need to know who their customers are. So, can you build on that at all in terms of, sort of the shape of customer identity and how it relates to internal?
That's one of those interesting sort of contradictions, isn't it? Supermarkets in the UK, and I think the UK has been one of those sort of global leaders in doing that sort of analytics on our customer base. Things like Clubcard and so on, which we've all heard of and used for decades now. I suppose that the contradiction is that supermarkets haven't always been quite as good at turning that lens on their own workforce. And as Tim said, that workforce can be really diverse, lots of different parts to it, making goods, delivering them, working in the stores. And actually, GDPR, which isn't that long ago, I'm feeling old now, but that actually marked a bit of a shift in that people working in stores who didn't really interact with IT, maybe they clocked on and off, but they didn't actually have logins to so on. But if they were dealing with customer service complaints, because they were dealing with people's data and they had to take a name and address, suddenly they needed a login. So I think gradually we have got a lot of that disconnected workforce actually starting to get more and more connected, even if it's just things like getting an e-pay slip. The identity challenges behind those huge workforces, and of course, very dynamic workforces, that huge increase that we tend to see sort of Christmas and Easter and over the summer even, makes it even more interesting and just fascinating places. The amount of human workforce they've got and the technology that has to sort of be brought to bear to enable them to do their jobs.
Yeah, great. And we've mentioned supermarkets a couple of times, but this is actually a problem that sits across retail, right? And not just large retail; it's mid-sized, smaller retailers as well. So I think it's quite, as you say, a broad problem in this space. So just thinking, Tim, about the threats that retailers face. How have they evolved over the last few years? What are the sort of things that have changed?
Firstly, I think you recognise that because there are so many people involved and cyber criminals want identities to use for fraudulent purposes. Supermarkets and retail are a prime target for identity-based fraud. I think there's also been a significant development of ransomware tailored specifically towards retail systems. But I think one of the main areas of concern is the involvement of third parties, and most retailers have a myriad of relationships with supply chain and other partners in helping to provide the services that they do. And I think, as we'll talk about in a little bit, when we illustrate compromises in the retail sector and how they have happened, you can't afford to trust your third-party access into your environment. You must always verify any access that's being granted and make sure that you monitor that access and treat it as though it's potentially compromised, and make sure that any access that's granted is granted for the right reason to specific systems and is fine-grained enough just to make sure that particular access can only do what you intend it to do.
Okay, that's interesting. So at the same one time, on one hand, we're saying that you shouldn't really trust third parties, but the second time, clearly, to run a business, you have to trust third parties. So where's the balance? How do you sort of strike that balance between, allowing a supplier into your business, into your network, but only doing it in such a way that they can't really cause too much damage?
Yeah, it's not about not trusting your partners and the organisations that support you. It's about not trusting those access requests because they could potentially be compromised. So it's a case of making sure that you set the conditions for that access to be granted. You monitor that access continually. You verify that it's legitimate. And if for any reason you think it's showing signs of malicious behaviour, you put a stop to it immediately and prevent any further activity happening.
Okay, excellent. Anything to add to that, Tom? Yeah.
I mean, I think just in general, talking about supermarkets and non-supermarkets, other retailers, and going back to the point around sort of that data analytics around your customers and what they're doing, it has been one of those interesting areas of identity, and that's why it's such an interesting part of cybersecurity to work in. I would say that. Is that all of those lessons we've learned from like e-tailers about, reducing the friction, making sure you don't have so many abandoned baskets, don't force someone to sign up with 20,000 bits of information just to make a single purchase. That sort of low friction at the right place at the right time, taking that lessons learned and bringing that across to the security world and kind of the identity management for workforce means that, finally we're kind of not the no police, we're not the ones putting loads of annoying security controls in place that get in the way, but actually, security can be an enabler. We can make things easier. We've had 10 years of forcing people to do MFA, but now we're giving people things like passwordless where actually it's easier. It's not as much of a pain. You're not doing it 20 times a day.
Yeah, we'll come back to some of those topics because there's some good points. I think.
So can I just come in on that one,
sure.
Richard? Because what Tim mentioned just now is that wide eco-structure of different partners, different suppliers, and what Tom's just mentioned is making it easy for people. And I think when we're looking at the technical side of it, obviously you guys are putting a lens on it to make sure the technical side is as smooth as possible, and at the same time always making sure that when we're looking at all of those different individuals who are required to sign in a particular way, that we've thought about their needs as well, because they can be your single point of failure, regardless of how sophisticated your system is. If you've got somebody who doesn't follow the rules, then they're potential a huge risk for you. So I think that it makes that one quite fascinating from a change perspective.
Yeah, tricky. And if it's okay, I'll stay with you, Isabel.
Please
Thinking
do.
about the, if they get it wrong, so if retailers get this wrong, what are the potential impacts? We know that there's, there's the possibility of, ransomware, fines, things like that. But I mean, really, particularly from a customer point of view, what's the sort of impact on brand, on the customer's sort of and reputational impact, I suppose?
As someone who is a keen shopper, Richard, I think if you lose your reputation, and that news will spread very fast through the media, customers will be loyal to a point, but as soon as they don't trust you, they will move. And given the margins within the industry, the retailers cannot afford to lose their customer. So it's a really, really high impact. And as a customer, I will go to a particular retail store as long as I believe they're giving me a good deal and they're looking after my data. But if I think they've ever exploited my information or been careless with it, I'm not going to go back, especially online. I don't know if it's potentially slightly less from an in-store perspective. And then, of course, you've got the regulatory damage as well, which could be extraordinarily costly for them to think about.
I guess some of that is down to how much data you actually share. So I think your point around the store is it could just be a transactional relationship. It could be, something where you don't have a loyalty account and you're just in there buying your groceries. Yeah. But actually we know pretty well that even just doing that, there are links to your credit cards. There are what your credit card company will be doing with that and sharing back with the supermarket as well, potentially, or other retailer. So there's definitely more to it than just that single transaction. So your data is definitely being shared. Yeah. Tom, just from another point of view, if you had your details shared, your personal details, payment details, even or breached, should I say, by one of your retailers of choice.
Well, I won't name names, but there was a particularly bad Easter weekend, which of course double bank holiday. So great, but I wasn't placing bets in New York City. And two cards. So there's a common factor. I never did track down how it happened.
Do you want to expand on that a little bit for us with the background?
Yeah. So this happened to me. This is a few years ago now. But two bank holidays, perfect time for criminals to strike. Right. Lots of services aren't open. So some strange transactions started coming through. Somebody bought a large TV online with one card that had been compromised, but then another card. So I must have had two cards with the same retailer somewhere. Both cards were used for fraudulent transactions. Of course, during an Easter weekend, it's hard to get hold of the right services and get those cards blocked. And that happens to somebody in the cybersecurity industry who should know what to avoid. So it can happen to anyone. Would that change? I mean, I think it can happen to any service. If that had been a particular e-retailer that I used regularly, would that stop me using them? I don't know. But I think sometimes when these things happen on a large scale, and we've had some huge ones in the press, haven't we? Where they've been told there's a problem, done nothing with it for years, then there really is kind of they are at fault when those details get breached and misused. I could throw the question back, Richard. How would it feel? I mean, I don't know. Maybe people in the industry have seen the kind of level of controls and the maturity that's out there in some fairly big household names, and not blasé, but we kind of assume breach, that your details will have been breached in some of these places. And if you go to some of these websites where it looks at the various hacks and has your password been compromised and so on. I think my assumption is my details are out there. They've been breached in God knows how many services that I've signed up to in the past, which is a reminder to us all to use unique passwords, sign up for strong phishing-proof credentials, and so on and so on.
Yeah, indeed. And I suppose there's probably some level of difference in the type of retailer that you were that had breached your data. You probably don't mind people knowing that you bought 4 tins of beans, but there may be some stuff that you buy that you'd rather not share, or maybe luxury goods that you'd rather not. People didn't know about. So okay, fascinating. We've talked and we touched on it about the complexity of these environments, and particularly the fact that retailers will have, as you mentioned, Tim, sort of so many different parts of their business, so many different types of workforce, whether it's office-based, whether it's warehouse-based, shop-based, petrol station-based, etc. That is a hugely complex environment in terms of employees when you need to drive some level of change, particularly cultural change. A lot of the things we do within security, whether it's multi-factor authentication, relies on users doing something different. So I guess I'll come to you, Isabel, first. Just thinking about that sort of really complex environment, how do you navigate managing change successfully in something that complex?
It's a real challenging one. I think I'd start by saying that we need to make it as easy for people as possible, because I think we need to treat all of the individual stakeholders across that whole ecosystem as people and respect the fact that they're trying to do their job on a day-to-day basis, Nobody's trying to do a bad job. No one's trying to get round the system. They're just trying to do their job, and they're being measured on their KPIs. And whenever we come along with something that's a change, we need to make it as easy as possible for them. And so I'd start with a really solid foundation of user research across the various parties in the whole system. So the different types of stores, the small stores, the big stores, the franchisees, the suppliers, the drivers, anybody who's going to be touched in it, really understand what pain points, what does their day look like, how do we make it as easy as possible? Because what we know is people will always get round things if we make it too difficult. When you're looking at retail organisations, I was talking to a colleague this morning who used to work in the supermarket environment. Store managers are absolutely key. So make sure you've got the buy-in of your senior leaders, because if you don't have hearts and minds at that level, what you will get is a tick box exercise when you're asking people to do something different. Think about making sure that you've always got some user input, which can be difficult because people are really time poor. In that sort of environment, we're looking at making comms so easy. And of course, these individuals might not have access to their email all the time, so posters and flyers are always good. Your training has to be really, really targeted and bite-sized, and never contemplate doing a sheep dip exercise because it won't work. And you know, the line managers will have their KPIs and their tick boxes. So there's just some things like that along the way, making sure that you really make it as simple as possible for people.
I think it's an interesting one. We've done work with sort of charities and you know, charities with chains of high street shops, which obviously is, you know, when you think about the sort of the volume, the transaction, the challenges that the big supermarkets have, charities have it even harder. You know, it's a network of volunteers. Some of the assumptions you might make about, you know, who works where and therefore they need access to this, well, actually they float around shops, or sometimes they're a regional manager and other times they volunteer on a Saturday and do 2 shifts in the shop. So some of that kind of role-based, you know, what this person needs to do their job is actually really complicated. Which
is why that really strong grounding in user research is so important, to understand their day and don't assume.
And it's an interesting point, Isabel. And I think, you know, who in the organisation is usually responsible for that level of upfront work before landing change, because it could be an IT project that's making the change, and we all know that a lot of the time IT projects don't think about the big user impact part of it first of all, and we'll roll out, you know, a fairly standard training program to go with it. So, you know, where should that responsibility sit within the organisation, or how can retailers think about it differently?
That's a perennial challenge for change management, and I think I'd say, who owns the success of the system? Who's interested in whatever change we're putting in? You know, if it's a new identity access management system, who's interested in that being successful? Because they're the ones who are interested in, okay, we're doing this because we're reducing our risk, and therefore they own the success. They should be the one leading the challenge. And the users of the system are one of the biggest success factors in any implementation. So I suspect the risk owner, the head of cyber, is not going to be interested in owning it, and that's where the project may sit. But actually it'll be the head of cyber that's got to go and justify it to the business.
Yeah, indeed.
I think ROI on identity projects is a really interesting one, you know, and this is back to the point about sort of customer data and employee identity data. You know, if you buy too many burgers because you bought the wrong weather data and it wasn't accurate, and that goes in the bin, then there's, you know, somebody's measuring that, and that's bottom line. If you take slightly too long to provision access for, you know, Christmas workers, someone's noticing it, but very rarely does that get measured and get the right ownership to say, actually, we've got a problem here and we need to fix it. Again, it's that sort of dichotomy of actually same processes, but turn it on yourselves.
Yeah, so I think what you're hinting at there, and you've mentioned it previously as well, is there's a huge amount of efficiencies to be had and to be gained, which of course straight onto the bottom line, to do this, by doing this better. And you know, retail and sort of grocery in particular, which we've talked a lot about, you know, bottom line is everything, right? There's so little margin that those efficiencies, you know, if you
if you've got contractors sitting around for a couple of days doing nothing, that's you've got to sell a lot of tins of beans to make up.
Indeed. Great, thank you. And then just staying with the complexity question, but moving to more from the sort of technology side, Tim, and sort of the complexities in managing identities, particularly through the sort of the whole end-to-end of a transaction. Maybe you can share some of your experience in how that can be difficult.
Yeah, sure. Any retail organisation can have a number of different channels in which they go to market. It might be an online presence, it might be a telephony centre, there's obviously stores. I think in the way that I mentioned earlier, there's been a big bang of innovation to reach customers and to meet their shopping needs. It may now be a multitude of those different channels that are part of any single transaction. If you think about the different personas and identities that are involved from an end-to-end process of a shopping experience now, a customer will have multiple identities. They'll have their identity to log online. They'll have a loyalty identity. They'll have their card identities. The breadth of different identities and the sheer volume that are involved in creating one single shop for one family or for one individual. It's very complex.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And I guess for that whole end-to-end transaction chain you've just talked about, any breach of compromise of any of those identities can cause some level of issue, right? So clearly we know about a breach of user accounts. That's fairly obvious. But explain to me a little bit what can happen with the breach of a robot picking in the back of the store.
I think the key thing is, as we saw during COVID times, how vulnerable the supply chain can be to getting food into stores. And it is just in time. One of the key things about supermarkets and shops, they don't have warehouses on the back of the retail property. They deliver just in time goods on a daily basis. They've got computer systems that monitor stock and report back to picking systems in the warehouse, and they automate through complex conveyor belt systems, getting the right goods on the right lorries to deliver to the right systems. So if that system in the back end goes wrong and there's a compromise in the identity, the whole system falls apart and you don't get the goods to the shop sometimes. So ultimately you end up in a situation where an individual store or multiple stores struggle to actually trade and do business.
Yeah, so I think just reflecting on that a little bit, you're saying for any one transaction, for that customer to pick up something from the store, there's probably between 10 and 20 identities involved in that being able to be fulfilled.
Yeah,
and any breach of any of those, could effectively be the thing that either prevents that transaction from happening, whether because the goods aren't there, or because the payment's too fraud related, or whatever else it may be. So.
Yeah, and we've just spoken about the interaction of a customer with the retailer. When you think about the supply chain that support them and the different partners and the connectivity, the complete ecosystem that sits behind that as well, it just magnifies that challenge hugely.
It sounds it's massively complex.
It is.
So thinking again, moving on from the complexity and just thinking about the sort of threats that retailers are facing. I'm sure there's going to be lots of threats that are the same across industries, but in particular, Tom, come to you first. What are sort of the main threats you see at the moment that the retail industry really need to deal with?
I mean, I think one threat, and we sort of touched on this a few minutes ago, is because supermarkets in particular, they're just there. They're there on the high street, right? We've seen attacks with like barcodes. The barcodes that the supervisors can scan to give a discount and so on. Someone finds it, they figure out how to generate it, they print them out. You put it on your phone. You see those kinds of fraud basically. But because they're there on every high street, it's very easy to have a go, right? So you will see these kinds of attacks, and I think it's kind of an identity attack because you're impersonating a member of staff, right? As a business with a lot of value, there are obviously targets. I mean, I think when we've worked with supermarkets, we've seen all sorts of weird traffic coming in, like lots of fraudulent sign-ups to the online app. Not clear how that's going to turn into attack, but it's kind of something's afoot. They're just a huge target area because of who they are and what they represent, and all of the value in that chain.
And I think just to come in there, Tom, as well. I mean, there's a lot of growing understanding of how AI can help businesses and make them more productive. The same is absolutely true for criminals. And one of the particular threats that supermarkets are facing at the moment is the use of AI and fake details to generate fraudulent accounts, to sign up for credit, to sign up for store loyalty cards and programs. And that's a challenge, which is being met at the moment. Making sure, I think, in using credible or authentication solutions to prove identities, biometrics, making sure that you scan, driving licenses or passports of individuals to prove who they are is part of the answer to that challenge.
Yeah. I think also because of the high volume, sort of low transactional margin nature of the business, any friction you put in place has to be really worth it, because you don't want to slow down customers from coming in, making their purchase and getting out the door and putting money through the tills.
I think one of the interesting things, sorry Isabel, at the moment is some of the newer solutions that are coming out to help identity management and to protect businesses. They are based on lower friction solutions. So the opportunity there is to progress, to renew your identity solutions and also meet your business objectives. We've talked for years about IT being an enabler for the business, and we all pay a little bit of lip service to that and wonder when we're trying to do it, how do I make that work then? But in reality now, that's coming to fruition, and we're really seeing a way of achieving that.
Yeah. I was just going to reflect on something that Tom mentioned there about how you try and figure out when a customer logs in that they're a genuine person. And I've tried to buy something recently and they came back and said, "Oh, I'll need proof of identity." And I said, "Why? I don't want to send you my passport details. I don't know how kosher you are. The fact I've given them credit card details is something else." So that customer perception as well, you have to believe that a company is going to look after your information in order to complete a transaction. So there's definitely a balance to be had.
Yeah. It's something we're going to pick up in one of the other podcasts around sort of digital wallets and privacy, protecting digital identities that are, signed by a government or another authoritative body. Because why do I need to give you all that information just to buy something?
Yes.
You maybe need my date of birth or maybe not the date of birth, because that's actually, more specific. You just need to know I'm over 18, or maybe you need an address for delivery, but you don't need all of these other things about me.
Absolutely.
Flipping to the opposite, digital identity. I'm sure we've all been in busy supermarkets at the self-checkout where one store employee is running around frantically with a little barcode, like beeping on machines and putting transactions through and, approving underage type requests and all that sort of stuff. So, that feels to me to be quite a loose area, because as soon as they come over and put their PIN in, well, they're doing it right in front of the customer anyway. So technically all you need is that little barcode and you've got a ready-made identity you probably can't steal that much data with it, but you can certainly, do things that are against the law. So whether that's steal things or approve alcohol for under 18s, for example. So that feels like something that needs tightening up.
Yeah, and there is an I am angle to that, because if that barcode starts appearing in another store, does it work? Should that person be working in the other store? It's it's a credential effectively.
Yeah, indeed. So thinking about kind of making it real in terms of some of the bad stuff that's gone on, thinking about some of the retail specific breaches and incidents we've had. Clearly there was the textbook Target one that everybody talked about at the time. I think it was 2014, so it's going back quite some time now, but it still stands as the sort of exemplar of how not to do it. And I think, Tim, do you want to give us a few thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, it has been overanalyzed in terms of how it happened, but it was a third-party breach. One of Target's suppliers was targeted through a phishing attack. They stole some credentials. They were able to access Target's environment through a vendor portal. They quickly were able to move laterally, elevate privilege, get access to their point of sale system, and then load malware onto effectively their tills, their payment systems. That was effectively streaming off live card data to a server initially within the target environment, and then periodically that would send all that data off to a server that was in Russia, so that the card details were extracted quite efficiently. There were signals and alerts being raised which the security teams didn't respond to, and it was only when the US banks started to detect suspicious behaviour and traced it back to target that the breach came to life.
Yeah, indeed, and it was a huge amount of money that they lost in the end. Do you remember what the total was?
They were charged. They were fined by PCI $18.5 million. I think at the end of the experience, they estimated it had cost $200 million. There was a significant drop in share price. The CIO, the CEO had to resign. They lost 40 million card details, 70 million customer accounts, and a huge amount of trust. And it resulted at the time in a number of target stores simply not being able to operate.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't quite end of business for them, but it must have felt pretty close at times. The CEO having to resign, that's pretty dramatic. And a lot of those failings could have been fixed with better identity and access control, right?
I think that the one success story, if there is such a thing out of such a traumatic breach, was the introduction of chip and pin technology across the industry. So that was one of the key drivers for that. But if you look at the individual failings, yes, there was very little network segmentation, there were weak passwords, there was no multi-factor authentication in place, there were a whole raft of things which you would really expect to be part and parcel of any modern identity security system today.
Yeah, but although it was a while ago, the amount of companies we see that still don't have the requisite controls in place to stop some of that stuff is very, very common. So
it is, and whilst the technology that could have prevented that has become more standardised today, the attackers don't stand still either. They find ways to compromise what were leading technologies then are now standard technologies now. So multi-factor authentication's not foolproof anymore. It needs other technologies to go around it. So we've got to continue moving forward and maintaining ever better controls.
Yeah, indeed. Isabel, I think we were talking about an example earlier with the Morrison's breach. Do you want to tell us or kind of reflect on that conversation we were having?
Yes, indeed. It's an interesting one because it's all about internal processes being tight enough. And this was a Morrison's employee who had a grievance and had loads of access to the system that they potentially shouldn't have had, which resulted in them providing 126,000 people's worth of employee detail out to external sources. And it shows how important it is to have those tight processes. Why did one person have access to all this information? If somebody had a grievance, why wasn't that being tracked? Did somebody not look at their system access? Was there not data monitoring on to see, hang on a minute, all this data is being downloaded? Why? Because that's not a normal thing to do. So the lack of tight process there and systems in place resulted in quite a major issue from a reputational damage perspective, and an awful lot of people's information being put out to the external world.
Yeah, and I think it was payroll data as well in that example. Okay. So thinking about the challenge of maybe identity being either slightly misunderstood in terms of complexity and cost. I know from speaking to various different size organisations, it's for some, particularly the big ones, it's one of their top priorities. For the slightly smaller ones or medium-sized ones, it's often not on the radar because it's seen as, oh, that's a really complex thing to deal with, or that's a really expensive thing to deal with. Any thoughts to share on how true that is? Is it too complex? Is it too expensive? Who wants to go first, Tim?
I'll take the complexity angle and say no. For smaller or medium-sized businesses, that should make managing identity easier. We've already talked about some of the huge organisations with millions of customer identities and tens of thousands of employees, and creating an understanding of who should have access to what systems at what time in that scenario is immensely complex. For smaller organisations, that opportunity is scaled down. You still need to understand who's got access to what, but the less people, there are less systems that need to be accessed, and the usage patterns are probably more normalised as well. So to say that it's more complex and more expensive sounds to me like someone who's had a go and got it wrong.
Or potentially just doesn't understand it. Right,
Indeed, yes.
Is there an education piece that needs to happen to almost like remove the myth of that complexity or the myth of that cost?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Tom?
I mean, I think, certainly over the last sort of 10, 15 years, I mean, we mentioned MFA and, it's not enough anymore because the attackers have evolved as well. But I suppose, during my career, we've sort of gone from SSO being something that was new and, gradually getting all the systems onto it because it was a better user experience. You sign in once in the morning and all the websites and internal services just work. You're already logged in. Fantastic. And then we've had the advent of cloud, and a lot of those systems now aren't your internal systems. They're a Salesforce or a Workday or something outside. So this patchwork quilt, and actually what knits them together, the identity standards. So it still works as you'd expect it to work, but actually we're now working with third parties and making sure it all just logs in and works. I suppose it's that authentication bit with the MFA, which we've had a lot of focus on about getting you through the front door. It's what happens after that, what you're allowed to do in those other systems, the authorization bit, which actually in the last couple of years has become this is still a huge problem, getting visibility of that centrally so you can do any kind of governance over it and actually understand, have we got way too much access there? Everybody in that system over there is basically full admin, and that's a risk. Getting visibility of that is much harder, and as an industry, that authentication bit is kind of solved. We're evolving it with passwordless and reacting to the attackers figuring out how to get past MFA and do the tokens afterwards. But the authorization bit is still a huge problem. Lots of new standards coming along to sort of help us with that. But yeah, I think when somebody's looking at it and going, this is too big, it's too complicated, there are bits we haven't solved yet, but there's still lots you can do to, I think if you don't tackle it, you're saving up a lot of kind of technical debt and basically complexity, because if you allow people to have different logins for every system, your join and move a leaver process is going to be impossible. People will leave the organisation and retain access to systems they certainly shouldn't have access to, so that becomes a huge cyber liability, and it just becomes harder to manage.
Yeah, I think a lot of the time companies don't actually realise the capability that they have already got in terms of technology capability. Most companies use M365, Microsoft 365 suite, and that comes with a bunch of stuff that you can use straight out of the box. So I think there is generally a lack of understanding of what is available to me already and how easy it is to deploy sometimes. So I think there definitely needs to be
and getting easier. I think when Microsoft announced Entra as the new name for Azure AD, which was July, nearly 2 years ago now. I think within the month we were talking to clients who'd looked at some of the bigger identity solutions and said, we can't afford it, we don't have the team to run it. But we've got Microsoft licenses, what can we do with this? And the answer is kind of more every month. Not everything, but if you can get 80% of the way there, then that's fantastic.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think one of the first things that an organisation could do if it is concerned about the cost of looking at tools, a look at the tools that it's already got in place. And you can almost guarantee that there's going to be overlap of functionality. So you can probably start to rationalise and save money and then reinvest that saving more wisely in a more important tool that's going to improve your security in a much better way.
Okay, great. And I'm going to pick on one specific problem. I'm going to come to you, Isabel, because it's something we see all the time. And there's a really common problem that retailers have, particularly in stores. And it's that there's typically one or two computers out the back. Everybody that works in the store has to go and do something on it. Well, most people do at least. They don't want to bother logging in, so they just either leave it logged in if it allows them to do that, or there's just a shared password stuck on a post-it note that says this is the quickest way to do it.
Easy.
Really, really easy, absolutely. That's a cultural problem. That's a people challenge. It's not a technical challenge. How do you go about changing that culture or making it easier for people to follow the rules?
I think there's probably several things that you could look at in that circumstance. First of all, leading by example. So you have to get in with hearts and minds if you're looking at a store, to the store manager and then the team leaders, they have to understand the risks that people are taking when they do that. What's the potential outcomes from that? Yes, it's easy, so I don't have to remember my password because it's always logged on, but what are the risks and what's the outcomes for that? And it may be that the risk is that an individual employee is then going to be sacked because they use somebody else's account, and people have to understand that. So making sure that there's a hearts and minds thing done across the leadership, and then leading by example. You never ever want a team leader to demonstrate that behaviour. You always want your team leaders to be demonstrating the right behaviour. And then simple things like a big sign beside the computer. Always remember to log off. And you can do some really imaginative campaigns about, always log off because, and come up with some nice slogans within the environment. I'd also be looking at monitoring of log-ons on a device, because if there's only one log-on a device on every day, nobody's logged off. So you could track it that way. So I think I would always go for the encouragement and the hearts and minds and the lead by example and make it simple. But at the end of the day, if people are breaching their responsibilities, then you should be able to track that through and take action appropriately, because there are risks associated with it.
Absolutely.
I mean, the technology has to support it as well. If you hand out generic, store ABC as the username, then it's inviting people to use it as a shared resource.
Yeah.
I think also, the technology doesn't always support that kind of high volume, many users on one device. Tim and I worked with a healthcare client a couple of years ago who had exactly this problem in hospitals where, you might have 50 nurses all signing into a workstation to get blood results. But the chip in the computer can only cope with, I can't remember what the number was, like 28 or 30 concurrent logins with biometrics. So whilst the biometrics make that immediate problem of, the quick login, I don't want to type a password 100 times a day, if you can't support the number of users that are needed on that device, then it's out the window and we're back to typing passwords in again, which means you're encouraging either shared use or working around the controls, because the controls are applying the wrong amount of friction at the wrong time.
So I'm back to my user research. Understand the user journey and what is the technology that you're giving them, because if you're making it impossible for people, they've still got to do their jobs. So respect people's daily lives and make it as simple as possible.
Yeah, the example I always use with that was always the Apple iPhone. The fact that you had to use a thumbprint to unlock it. Now it's Face ID, so it's even easier. But that is a secure authentication method, but it's also very, very easy. So you make security the easiest path, and people will follow it. Great. So just thinking about advice, and Tim, drawing on your vast experience of doing this, if you were to talk to a retail executive in technology or security, what are the sort of three things that you would say if you're at the start of this journey or you're not sure how you're getting on? What are the three things that you really need to sort of do going forward?
This may sound like an uninteresting answer, because we're all interested about technology, right, and using technology to solve problems. But I think, at a more basic level, it's about understanding your access management landscape. You absolutely have to understand who's got access to what, for what reason, and when that access is being used. Because if you don't understand what access is being used in your business, any attempt to employ technology or to provide security controls is compromised from the start. So that would be the first step, and that's not an easy step. I mean, we've already talked about some of the complexity about different personas. It's not always human access. It can be bots. It can be AOI, all sorts of different access. So you need to use some technology to understand that and streamline the discovery, whether it's an application proxy that looks at what access is being channeled through into the internet, or whether it's an application gateway or connection device internally to see what systems are being accessed, and analyse that data and to understand what the normal patterns are, what normal behaviour is, and then start to build as your third step, policy-based access control model, so that you don't have to worry so much about individuals and what specific entitlements they need. You can define your policy and you can check at any time an access request comes in, whether that access policy or that access request is in line with that policy, and make a decision as to whether to grant it or not.
Yeah.
And anything that seems not quite right about that, then you can deny it.
Yeah, I think this is quite a big problem for customers, particularly even large organisations we work with who've spent loads of money on tooling that can control who can access what, but they haven't actually put the work in on who should access what. And that is actually a huge piece of work, which has to be led by each business department. And so each business system needs to know who should be accessing their systems and at what times, and be able to track that against what against the policy essentially. And that's the bit I often find is not done. So one of the common problems I see with identity programs, particularly at scale, is that it takes a customer about 2 years into a project before they realise that there's a problem with the data. And that problem is typically there is no single source of truth. So a lot of companies use Active Directory to manage accounts. Some companies try to use HR data to do that. And if you try to do role-based access control in particular, which is allowing people access to systems based on their role, there's often a conflict between what they were set up as in one system versus what their job now is in another. And one of the ways we've looked at and we've seen solutions in the market for this is a single source of truth for identity. Some call it a data identity fabric. Tom, I know you've done quite a bit on this. Do you want to tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, before we make it better, should we make it worse? I think in retail in particular, there tends to be quite a lot of acquisitions, and sometimes they will buy companies and then decide it didn't work and sell them again. So that single source of truth is actually changing all the time and isn't really one single source. It's probably a combination of your HR source, but also your contractors, your third parties that you work with, and quite often like the big third parties that might supply whole teams. If you can't get the data clean, how can you possibly give people the access to systems and so on that they need to get the job done? An identity data fabric, as we talked about, getting your data in one place where you can slice and dice it and see what you need to see is really important, and often that won't be directly from an HR source or any other sort of golden source of particular people, because that will be for another business purpose. It will be for HR, it will be for payroll, it will be for contracts with third parties. So bringing that into one place where identity is the key owner of that data and can clean it and deduplicate it and make sure it's fit for purpose, then allows you to use that in a trusted way downstream to make decisions, whether that's provisioning an account in AD, giving you an account in Google Workspace, Entra, or in some factory warehouse system. But if you don't have that clean data source to start with, it makes it much harder. Once you have got that, and I think a lot of organisations who didn't have it, who then got it, went, this would have made all those projects that we failed at much easier, because if you're doing mergers and acquisitions, if you're bringing companies in, actually they just become another source into the system, and if you need to see them as part of the whole company, you can, and if you need to see them as they were, you can. Yeah. And their systems that they bring with them can either see the whole company or certain facets of it. Yeah. It's an incredible enabler, and it doesn't seem to be on most people's kind of identity technology shopping list, because they don't know they need it until it's too late.
It's one of those problems that you don't know you've got until you are already well into trying to sort this problem out, which if you knew at the front, hindsight is a wonderful thing, that particular component added into the identity program would have prevented a lot of delays and a lot of technical issues.
And with cloud now being everything goes faster, right? And I think this is one of the podcasts we did last year, everything going faster in technology. Some of the kind of this technology used to be called virtual directories. It was bring everything into one place and then slice and dice it and show which systems need to see it in which different way. They're going faster because you need real-time decisions. Is this user doing what they should be doing right now? It's 2:00 on a Sunday morning. Should they be logging into that system? Maybe if we're in the middle of a security incident, but normally no. So they need to be pretty much real time.
Yeah, and I think you picked on an important point there, Tom, in the dependence that identity of the future will have on identity fabric. In the past, if identity data is disparate across different solutions, a company can replicate manual process, it becomes inefficient, but you can work your way through that. If we're going to move to more modern identity solutions moving forward, where we've got attribute-based access, policy-based policy-based access. We're using policy decision points and policy enforcement points as we expect to do. That has to be real time. And it has to be based on a clean set of data. So that becomes absolute front and foremost in identity solutions moving forward. So I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about identity fabric.
Yeah, and as you say, those decisions, if you don't own the data and HR decide to, redo the org chart and change everyone's cost code, and that means that everyone loses access on Monday morning when they come in, who's going to get blamed for it? HR or the guys that run the IAM systems? We depended on some data that we didn't own, and now we've caused an outage.
Yeah.
And from a non-technical perspective, I don't think we should underestimate the amount of effort that this can take, because I'm working with a very large client just now, and their basic HR data is not sound. It doesn't reflect the organisation, and that's the starting point that many organisations will be at. So if we're looking at a lovely, beautiful identity management system, some people have got a very difficult journey to get there, and I'm sure we can help them every step of the way in a nice, measured process.
Yeah, it's always been the first starting point of any role-based access control project is get a clean set of data, because if you don't, you can buy the best tools and have the best processes, but you put junk data in, you get
data out.
Exactly. Wrong decisions being made.
I think Tim and I have had umpteen conversations about this over the years, but actually if you wait for clean data, you will never get started. So we need to be able to build identity architectures where we assume the data is not clean, we don't trust it, and it may do unexpected things. I dread to think how many organisations will, recognise this, but, something goes wrong with the HR system, and over the weekend it tells you that all of these people have left because one flag changed, and it removes all of their access. It happens far too often. So you need to control the data. You need to do it in a very defensive way that, the data that comes in may not be good. You're responsible for cleaning it and then for what happens downstream.
And I think you've got to recognise as well that whilst there needs to be a single source of the truth, different stakeholders will have different interests in different parts of that data, and they'll want to, update that data that's relevant to them, and we have to have a system that is able to support that.
Yeah. I mean, we work with clients where things like your official title, if you have certifications and so on. Some systems downstream will actually use that to decide what access you get or what buildings you can go into or what rooms you go into. In other systems, the downstream might be the phone book, and actually I want my name to appear differently in the phone book, but if I can't make that change, or if I can, and then that impacts the access I have, that's some of the challenges that we have with the sort of the identity data and how it might end up being used downstream.
Yeah.
Indeed. Right. Well, just sort of thinking about wrapping it up and bringing it to a close. In all your experience, and thinking about the current retail threats and the landscape, what would be your bits of advice? If you had a bit of advice that any retail CISO or would take, what would be your words of wisdom, Tom?
Data. It's all about the data. Identity problems are all about the data, whether it's the visibility of who's actually using what, getting all the same thing that you've done with your customers, get all the data into one place, get the visibility over it, look for the inconsistencies, understand it, because you can then do the cleaning in the right way to feed the tools that you've already bought. You're probably not using them effectively. You can probably sweat a lot more value out of them, but if the data's not right, it's really hard to do. It's all about the data.
Great. Isabel, any final thoughts from yourself? Any advice?
Absolutely. It's all about the people.
It's all about the data. It's all about the people. It's all about the tech.
Absolutely. I'll say it's all about the technology, and I think one area that's gone through the hype cycle is zero trust, and making the identity your perimeter, and everyone's heard of that phrase, and I think we're actually at a place now where the hype has died down a little bit, and technologies are in place and coming onto the marketplace that can make that a reality. So I think another look now at serious technology that can enable that vision is the right thing to be thinking about.
Fantastic.
Can I just finish on the three things that I would advise
Absolutely.
customers to think about? Is one, really be realistic about the changes you want to make. So to Tom's point, you can plan all this stuff and you get halfway through a project and it doesn't happen. Be realistic because your people are already busy. Make it as easy as possible. Really respect the fact that all of your people are really busy, so make it as easy as possible for them. And then figure out, what are you going to measure to say that this thing's a success? And how are you going to keep reinforcing that? Because if you don't do that, you're going to fail, but you'll have invested all this money, which is such a shame. So they're the three things that I would end with for when I think about the people.
Wise words. Great. Okay, so I'd just like to thank our guests today for what was a great discussion. We'll be back with another episode of identity security related podcasts in the very near future. So thank you, Tom. Thank you, Isabel. And thank you, Tim.